Adolescents who engage in volunteer activities also appear generally, but not universally, to benefit in self-esteem and psychological well-being. In terms of self-esteem, research conducted in places as diverse as inner-city Detroit and Israel has found that students who volunteer to tutor show significant increases in their self-esteem. Winter, 1996, also found increases in self-esteem and feelings of general self-worth among girls who volunteered and gains in intrinsic motivation to learn among all students. However, these effects do not appear to generalize to students who are handicapped or emotionally disturbed. In addition, Lee, 1997, found no impact of volunteering during the first year of college on self-esteem or academic self-efficacy. In fact, the student's self-esteem generally went down over the year, and the most powerful variable contributing to this decline was grade point average. With respect to measures of general well-being, however, the findings for the psychological effects of volunteering on teenagers are inconsistent. On the one hand, a number of studies that investigated psychological effects of volunteer work on adolescents have found significant positive effects not only on variables such as these discussed earlier, e.g. discipline problems, level of alienation, moral development, positive attitudes toward adults, but also on self-acceptance. However, other studies have revealed no effects of volunteering on subsequent levels of depression, academic achievement, or self-esteem and other well-being factors. Overall, then, there is evidence for social and psychological benefits of volunteering among adolescents, but the findings are also somewhat mixed in this age group. The situation is quite different, however, for studies of how volunteering affects adults and the elderly. Effects of volunteering and helping on adults and the elderly. Being a volunteer requires that a person take on new responsibilities and assume roles in addition to those he or she occupies at work and at home. Sociologists such as Sieber, 1974, and Thwaites, 1986, suggested that adding social roles will enhance psychological and physical well-being, and empirical research on this question quite strongly supports this position. This is known as the role accumulation approach. Thwaites suggested that the social roles a person assumes voluntarily, e.g. friend, volunteer, may be more responsible for the positive effects of multiple roles than are obligatory ones, e.g. being a parent. This again would be consistent with reactance theory. Does volunteering lead to psychological and physical well-being? We consider adults from early adulthood through later adulthood and the elderly separately. With respect to adults, much of the research on this question has looked at membership in voluntary associations rather than the number of hours volunteered, but the results are quite clear. There is a positive relationship between the number of voluntary memberships and indicators of psychological health, such as increased self-esteem, decreased depression, and greater life satisfaction. Most of this research is correlational, but, as we noted earlier, the researchers looked at people over an extended period of time in some of these studies, and therefore have been able to statistically control other variables that could be the true causes of effects observed. These methodological features can increase our confidence in the conclusions the researchers have drawn. These studies do not tell us about the effects of volunteering per se, but other studies do. For example, Van Willigen, 1998, found positive effects of both attending voluntary association meetings and the number of hours of volunteer work on life satisfaction and depression. Thwaites and Hewitt, 2001, studied the long-term impact of the number of volunteer hours on 6 measures of well-being: happiness, life satisfaction, self-esteem, mastery, depression, and physical health. The most significant positive effects were on life satisfaction and feelings of mastery. These effects remained even after other possible causes of well-being were statistically controlled. Other studies have examined whether people's well-being increases as the amount of volunteering they do increases, a so-called dose-response effect, a term from medical research meaning that the greater the amount of a drug, the greater the effects, or whether increased volunteering is beneficial only up to a certain point. In other words, if some volunteering is good, is more better. In general, among adults, higher levels of volunteering are directly associated with better personal outcomes, i.e. a dose-response effect. People who volunteer more subsequently show lower levels of depression. particularly after age 65, greater psychological well-being, and a lower likelihood of Alzheimer's disease at age 70. Lowe and Herzig, 2002, also found that volunteering leads to better health and lower mortality, but beyond a certain point, 100 hours a year, an increase in volunteering was unrelated to health outcomes. Research conducted among older people, the elderly, produces even stronger findings. There is a positive relationship between the amount of volunteering an elderly person does and his or her psychological well-being. There also appears to be a relationship between volunteering and physical health and mortality rates among the elderly. For example, Moen et al. 1989 found that higher levels of participation in clubs and volunteer activities were associated with lower levels of mortality among elderly women. In another study with the same women, Moen et al. Found the same effects on 3 other measures of health: self-appraised health, time to serious illness, and functional ability. Moreover, the impact of volunteering on lowering mortality rates increases as those volunteering get older. Finally, Midlarsky and Kahana, 1994, did an experiment in which some elderly volunteers received specific individualized information that would aid them in their volunteering, whereas other elderly volunteers did not. Those given the information did indeed volunteer more often. This intervention resulted in increases in self-esteem as well as subjective social integration, i.e., a positive sense of being more a part of their community. Findings such as these led Midlarsky and Kahana, 1994, to propose a model of how volunteering and other kinds of helping may contribute to healthy aging. It is shown in Figure 7.3. Figure 7.3, Contributory Model of Successful Aging. Okay, so it's a flowchart. So 2 types of factors lead to helping behavior. So these are personal factors, resources, health, finances, other demographics, motives, empathy, internal locus of control, social responsibility, perceived importance of helping, altruistic orientation, and situational factors, perceived opportunities to help, help received from others, risks, costs of helping. So these lead to helping behavior, family, neighbor, and volunteer contexts, which lead to psychosocial well-being, morale, self-esteem, and social integration. And you can see that the personal factors will lead to psychosocial well-being, regardless of whether you volunteer or not. The model first proposes that, consistent with the position taken throughout this book, helping is the product of both situational and personal variables. Note that some of the specific personal factors identified in the model are the ones we discussed earlier, e.g., empathy, personal responsibility. Similarly, the situational variables included in the model have been discussed in this and other chapters in the book, e.g., risks, costs of helping. These 2 kinds of variables combine to affect the amount of helping in which people engage, helping behavior. Helping behavior, in turn, is directly related to psychosocial well-being. The more people help, the better they feel. Although Midlarsky and Kahana were not able to directly test the validity of their model, it is consistent with the results of their experiment as well as the other studies we have presented. Although the studies with adults show a consistent relationship between volunteering and a range of personal outcomes, the meaning of this relationship, along with the findings for adolescents, needs to be interpreted with caution. Most of these studies are non-experimental. Participants were not randomly assigned to conditions, and there was no direct manipulation of volunteering involved. There is always the problem with non-experimental data of whether the presumed effect, here, well-being and health, is a real causal effect, merely a correlate of the effect of interest, or perhaps one of a larger set of factors that causes the volunteering. However, the causal impact of volunteering is supported by the experimental studies that have been conducted, and by longitudinal studies that not only show that volunteering precedes changes in well-being, but also that statistically controlling for reciprocal effects, e.g., that healthier people are more likely to volunteer, does not eliminate the consistent finding that volunteering is indeed good for you. Explanatory mechanisms. All of these findings beg the question of why volunteering has these positive effects. We first consider the psychological consequences of being a volunteer. Thwaites and Hewitt, 2001, suggested two potential mechanisms by which these effects might be produced. First, it gives people a sense that they matter. Second, volunteering is a role identity that gives meaning and purpose to life. Midlarsky, 1991, proposed 5 reasons why helping others may benefit the helper: by providing a distraction from one's own troubles, by enhancing the sense of meaningfulness and value in one's life, by having a positive impact on self-evaluations, by increasing positive moods, and by enhancing social integration based on social skills and interpersonal connections. Related work by others has added to this list the possibility of enhanced feelings of efficacy and control. There has been relatively little research that has directly examined the validity of these reasons and explanations, but Music et al. 1999 did find that volunteering was most likely to lead to better physical and mental health among people who were relatively socially isolated. Lee and Farrow, 2005, using the same dataset, found that widows increased their volunteering after widowhood and that these new roles protected against depressive symptoms. Further, the number of volunteer hours enhanced self-efficacy. Thus, volunteer participation can help to offset the negative impact of widowhood on well-being. A. Pilyavin, 2005, using the Wisconsin longitudinal study, also found that people in their 50s who were less well integrated into society, e.g. unmarried, not working, with low levels of perceived social support, benefited more psychologically from doing volunteer work. Thus, volunteering could have served to prevent or ameliorate alienation and anomie. She also found that psychological well-being, a measure that includes a sense of purpose in life, mediated the impact of volunteering on self-reported health. In more recent analyses, Pilyavin, studying the same people when they were 64 to 65 years old, attempted to investigate whether other mechanisms, e.g. volunteering identity, volunteer motives, and the feeling of mattering, mediate these relationships. Figure 7.4 shows the findings of both analyses. Volunteering earlier in life leads to stronger volunteer motives, volunteer identity, and the sense of mattering for individuals in their 60s. Another contribution of this study is to suggest that, over and above the direct impact of both their volunteering activities and how psychologically healthy these individuals felt in their 50s, mattering may further contribute to their well-being in their 60s. That is, it is possible that early volunteers have better psychological well-being in their 60s because their earlier volunteering made them feel that they mattered in the world. However, caution must be exercised in drawing this conclusion because mattering and well-being are being measured at the same point in time. With regard to the effects of volunteering on physical health and mortality, Oman et al. 1999 suggested that several of Midlarsky's proposed mechanisms, e.g. improved morale, self-esteem, positive affect, could influence the body through psychoneuroimmunologic pathways, thus reducing mortality rates in aging populations. However, no one has yet attempted to measure immune function in relationship to volunteering. Figure 7.4. Effects of volunteering on well-being are strongest for those who are the least socially integrated in their 50s. Volunteering earlier in life leads to stronger volunteer motives, volunteer identity, and the sense of mattering for individuals in their 60s. Mattering may mediate the path from volunteering to psychological well-being. Dashed lines indicate relationships of variables at the same point in time. Okay, so it's an age flow chart. So it starts in the 50s with 17 to 18-year-olds who are female. Achievement, high school activities lead to volunteering when the students are between 35 to 36 years old, which leads to volunteering when the students are between 52 to 53 years old. Volunteering then leads to integration, psychological well-being, and physical health, and leads to when they are 64 to 65 years old, volunteer motives and identity, mattering, more volunteering, psychological well-being, and physical health. Finally, it needs to be mentioned that different kinds of volunteering and helping will have different effects, and that not all forms of helping may be beneficial for the helper. For example, most of the AIDS volunteers in Snyder and Omato's research dropped out because their work was emotionally debilitating. The generally positive impact of volunteer helping on mental and physical health also may not extend to long-term family caretaking. The recipient of help, reactions to help and help seeking. Through the previous chapters, we have approached our study of prosocial behavior by examining the multiple factors that affect a helper's decision of whether or not to provide aid and assistance to a person in need. Understanding why a person does or does not help another has been the primary goal to this point, but now our focus of attention shifts from the helper to the recipients of help, and a very specific question is asked: what factors affect a person's decision to seek and accept help from others? As we briefly discussed in the previous section, people in need will sometimes reject offers of help. It is even more common for a person to have a problem and to be unwilling to seek help from others. Why would people not seek or accept help from others? One basic reason is that receiving help has implications for how one feels about himself or herself and how a person is perceived by others. Impact of being offered help. Offers to help a person meet a need, no matter how well intended, can at times also have negative consequences. On the one hand, it seems that the recipient should be pleased that the problem has been confronted and dealt with successfully. One would expect the recipient to be thankful for the helper's contributions and appreciative of the assistance. This is certainly the expectation of many egoistically motivated helpers who may have offered the assistance primarily to make themselves feel good and who are looking for a word of thanks to bolster their own self-image. See Chapter 4. On the other hand, the recipient may experience self-doubts about his or her competence and feel that the relationship with the helper has been changed as a result of the help received. These consequences are the costs that were considered when deciding whether or not to ask for assistance, and these reactions represent the bill that comes due after the help has been received. Ari Nadler and Jeffrey Fisher proposed a comprehensive model that attempts to predict and explain people's positive and negative reactions in situations such as these. It is called the threat to self-esteem model of reactions to help, and is presented in Figure 7.5. The threat to self-esteem model provides a comprehensive description of how people react to help they receive from others. A very important premise of the model is its assumption that receiving help is neither all good nor all bad. It is the relative amounts of self-threat and self-support that ultimately determine a particular recipient's reaction to being helped. The model begins with the kind of help that is given, the person who gives it, and the person who receives it. See the box on the far left of Figure 7.5. As we have seen, these variables individually and in combination affect how the recipient perceives being helped. Helping can either be seen as threatening or supportive by the recipient. The next box is in the model. Let us consider each of these reactions. Figure 7.5. Threat to self-esteem model for recipient reactions to aid. Okay, it's a flowchart, starting with conditions associated with a receipt of aid, i.e. characteristics of the aid, characteristics of the donor, characteristics of the recipient, context characteristics, lead to the magnitude of relative or absolute self-threat or self-support inherent in the aid for the recipient, which leads to a continuum of effects on self-esteem. On the one hand, it can be high relative or absolute threat to the recipient's self-esteem, which leads to negative affect, negative evolution of donor and aid, high negative and low positive reciprocity, low help-seeking, high refusal of aid offers, and high degree of subsequent self-help. The continuum of effects on self-esteem can also lead to high relative or absolute self-support for the recipient, which leads to positive affect, positive evaluation of donor and aid, low negative and high positive reciprocity, high help-seeking, low refusal of aid offers, low degree of subsequent self-help. People who are offered or who receive assistance are most likely to see help as threatening when it challenges the recipient's freedom and autonomy, implies an obligation to repay the favor, but provides no opportunity to do so, suggests that the recipient is inferior to and dependent on the helper, particularly someone originally perceived as socially comparable to the recipient, is received for an ego-central task, and is inconsistent with the positive aspects of the recipient's self-concept. Such help produces defensiveness and negative feelings in the recipient because of three basic processes. First, helping that makes someone feel dependent and obligated in the future arouses psychological reactance, which is a negative state related to feeling that one's freedom is compromised. Second, helping that a person cannot reciprocate violates a sense of equity, a feeling of balance, which is violated when they receive more than they can give back. And third, receiving assistance can produce negative attributions about oneself, e.g., the lack of competence to deal with one's own problems, or the intentions of others, e.g., concerns about being taken advantage of. Receiving assistance from someone formerly seen as comparable to you can imply that you are now inferior to them. As a consequence, receiving unsolicited help from them may be experienced as particularly threatening. Claude Steele, 1992, discussed one implication of these attributional processes for people of color. In particular, he proposed that programs that are designed to be helpful, but that primarily emphasize the deficiencies of a particular group, create a suspicion of inferiority for recipients. This suspicion, if it is compounded by traditional stereotypes, is especially detrimental to participants' self-esteem. As a consequence, affirmative action programs may have benefits for targeted groups, but they also can, under some circumstances, have damaging negative effects on the self-esteem of the beneficiaries.